Good morning to everyone, good afternoon, good evening. This is Daniel Blank speaking. I'm the director of the Accounting Rules project, and I wanted to give you a warm welcome to our webinar series on tracking NDC achievement, new accounting perspectives. This is the second webinar of our free series, and today we want to talk about tracking NDC progress through policies and measures. I therefore give you a warm welcome and would like to introduce you the two projects financed both by the ICI, by the International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Protection, Building and Nuclear Safety. The projects are the Accounting Rules project for the achievement of the mitigation goals of non-Annex I countries, which is implemented in Mexico, Costa Rica and Colombia, together with the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, which is providing us the platform to run this webinar. Maybe some of you have participated in the first webinar, where we had an introduction by Mrs. Kirsten Orscholuk from the BMOB for the series. I will afterwards give you a short linkage to the first webinar and also to the third one. And before that, I would like to familiarize you with some technical details, and then we can get started. So in the first webinar, we discussed about the general accounting guidance that is given by the Paris Agreement, and we discussed how to frame NDC accounting. If you are interested in seeing the presentations and also in hearing the voice recording, you can refer to the Transparency Partnership, where you should just see the link on your screens. Today we will have the second webinar, and by the end of July, probably in the last week of July, we will have a third webinar, a third session on the accounting for the agriculture, forestry and other land use sector. Just let me introduce you some technical details. You will have the option to ask us question whenever you want. You would need to use the chat box, which is on the left part and the left bottom part of your screen, of your server screen. You can write us via the chat any question you want. Please send it to all presenters only. You can select this in the recipients list, in the drop-down list, in order to not litter the chat box of all participants, and then just click on send. Okay. I just wanted to give you a short context for this webinar. Last time we discussed a lot about the general accounting principles, and you can see on this slide how accounting is linked with the overall NDC planning process, and also with the global stocktake. GIZ accounting in terms of the Paris Agreement is meant to monitor the NDC achievement at national level, and this information again feeds back into the global stocktake, where the monitoring and the assessment is done whether all NDCs worldwide suffice to achieve the global temperature goal, to remain or to stay below a global warming below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels by the end of the current century. And countries used national mitigation potentials, criteria of fairness and ambition, criteria of responsibility and capability, under the concept of the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, in order to plan the NDCs and to decide what the NDC mitigation contribution could be. And at the national level, this now needs to be implemented. And how is it implemented? Through policies and actions. And this is why today in this second webinar we want to discuss about how policies and actions can be used to monitor NDC progress, and in how far this is different or even also similar to NDC accounting. And we will have 3 speakers that will give you technical inputs on this topic. You can see on this next slide that from the Accounting Rules project we are working basically in 4 areas. One is on NDC accounting, another one is on the linkage of NDC accounting to CTU, to the clarity, transparency and understanding of the NDCs asked for under the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. The third area is on the integration of accounting with existing instruments in the countries, basically with inventories, MRV elements, like institutional MRV structure, emission registries, MRV of mitigation actions of NAMAs, for example. And also we have a fourth area, which is on NDC implementation, where we look at questions like harmonization with the definition of sectors, sector targets, and so on. Today we want to focus on the third part, the alignment with MRV and national inventories, and this is where we will have the presentations of my colleagues. Just before presenting you the first presenter, I wanted to recommend you to consult the Transparency Partnership website. There, by the end of the week, you will find a first presentation related to the last webinar, which is about the starting points for GHG accounting of developing countries under the Paris Agreement. There we discussed the accounting principles as they have been presented in the Paris Agreement, and discussing how far they can be translated into concrete rules and recommendations at the country level. By mid-August, we want to have another second presentation on inventoriability, which is just the topic that will be introduced now by our first speaker. You can see this here on this agenda. Our first speaker will be Mrs. Verena Graichen from our technical partner, the Öko Institut from Berlin in Germany. And she will give an input on how to improve the reflection of mitigation outcomes in the GHG inventory. And then afterwards we will have a second presentation from Mr. David Rich from the World Resources Institute on tracking progress of policies and actions. And as a third presentation, Mrs. Marion Vieweg will present on the linkages to bottom-up inventories of mobile source emissions. With this, I want to conclude, and I would hand over to my colleague Verena Graichen. She works, as I said, with the Öko Institut. She's there as a senior researcher. She's an expert in carbon markets and has extensive knowledge on the EU emissions trading scheme and on the aviation sector in terms of emissions. She also developed energy efficiency indicators and at the EU level collected and assessed mitigation actions of the member states. And currently she supports us in the Accounting Rules project in Costa Rica in the formulation of a national accounting system for Costa Rica, and also did an application of the inventorability, sorry it's a hard word, inventorability exercise on some NAMAs in Costa Rica. And she will certainly be happy to share her experiences with all of you. So with this I hand over. I wish you an interesting webinar, and feel free to send us your questions via the chat functions whenever you want. Thanks.
Good morning everybody, and thank you Daniel for introducing me and for this opportunity to speak here at the webinar. I'm talking about inventorability. So what's that? It's the effort to make sure that the effects of policies and measures are really reflected in the greenhouse gas inventory. And this becomes more key as more and more countries take over ambitious targets and may not have inventories that reflect those efforts. And that would be a shame, of course, because especially countries with who really want to move along should also see the effects of their efforts. Currently in the project, I'm focusing on Costa Rica, so I will also talk about a few examples from Costa Rica and the other countries we're working with currently in Latin America, that are Mexico and Colombia. Oh, so that moved one too far. So what's the difficulty of quantifying measures? If you have a measure to improve your greenhouse gas efficiency, then normally it is very difficult to quantify the exact results, because there are overlap with other policies, there are lots of other influence factors, and there might be cross-effect to other sectors of the inventory. And therefore, adding up the emission reductions from all measures normally gives us a very different picture of looking on the inventory and see the summed up effects of all the measures and the other influence factors in the countries. So to measure whether the climate targets are reached or not, the inventory is the first place to go. That's the key part to measure the progress towards climate targets. But if this is the key position to measure whether climate targets are reached, of course we have to make sure that the inventory really can reflect the efforts that has been done. So it is important to harmonize the methods used in the inventory and to also adopt them to the measure, like the measurement of the measures, so to say, to make sure that we follow the same methodologies. David later on is going to talk a bit more about the assessment of the measures, so I'm focusing here on the inventory part. So can the inventory replace the monitoring of measures? And normally, no. Because if I have a measure and it might be very successful, we can still maybe not see the same effects in the inventory. So I take an example from Germany. I'm from Germany, so that's always a good starting point. And it is about the renewable energy supporting scheme. So the share of renewable energies was enhanced greatly, and the expectation was that then emissions from electricity generation should drop. But this might not be true if other factors intervene. So maybe if the electricity demand increases a lot, despite an increase of renewables, there might be a constant share of emissions, or what was the case in Germany, the rest of the electricity generation may change a lot and thus not reflect the enhancement of renewables. But the emissions may also decrease to other factors than the support scheme. For example, if we would implement emission standards for conventional generation, or there might be price changes for either the fuels, so coal might get more expensive and natural gas cheaper, so that might shift the fuel mix, or maybe the technologies get cheaper. We've seen that with renewables a lot, that constructing renewables has gotten a lot cheaper than it was when those policies were decided and implemented. So normally inventories do not reflect single measures, except if there is a single technology driver and a uniform methodology. That's normally, especially in countries that have many sectors and many policies, that's seldom the case, but it might be in other countries that have not so many industrial sectors, for example, it might be easier to see that. So if we look at the German example, we have the renewable energy generation, and you see here, I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse, no you can't. The line that is down there, the dark blue one, shows the share of renewable energy in electricity consumption in Germany. So you see that there has been a huge increase over the last years, starting from 2000. And but the emissions have not reflected that. So if you look at the emissions, and those are the upper light blue line, then you see that there is more and more coal in the remaining mix, and this is eating up a bit the effect of the renewables. But of course, if there wouldn't have been this renewable policy, emissions are expected to have increased in the past. So there has been an effect, but it has not led to a total decrease of emissions. But just to show an example how it is different is NTO emissions from nitric acid production here from the EU as a whole. And there you can see that even though the production increased, that's the upper line, the dark blue one, emissions dropped and significantly. And this is because first NTO emissions from nitric acid production were reduced with using GI projects, and later it was introduced into the ETS, and then it became economic to install catalysts and destroy the NTO. So we see here a massive impact of the climate policies that led to dropping emissions despite the increase of production. So how can we make sure that the inventory reflects the effects of all policies and measures, or at least of all major policies and measures? The basic principle for inventories is emissions are always activity times emission factor, and depending on the level of accuracy, the IPCC has defined 3 tiers. And in tier 1 you take national activity data and default emission factors from IPCC. In tier 2, the national activity data is multiplied with national emission factors that of course have to be studied and updated regularly. And in tier 3, the activity data is improved a lot. It's bottom-up activity data for each source, and there might even be source-specific emission factors, or at least national emission factors. And whether or not our measure can be reflected in tier 1 already, or only in tier 2 or 3, really depends on the measure and on the sector. And I will make some examples there, because once the inventory is done, the general rule with IPCC is that the key source category, those with most emissions and those with most change in emissions, they should use the highest tier, whether the minor categories can use a lower tier. So if we want to check whether our inventory is reflecting the mitigation efforts in the country, we will have to look at the different inventory categories, and the start is to have a look whether the major category are using a high tier, and then whether the measures we want to see reflected in the inventory affect a sector with a high tier. So just to illustrate it a bit, how can it be that the measure is not reflected in the inventory? So one option is that the source is not covered at all in the inventory. So speaking about Costa Rica, as I told you, we're just working with them, is we found that they have a lot of animals on meadows, and one mitigation action is to plant more trees on those meadows. Like some meadows already have trees and others don't, so some additional trees can help drive emissions down, but those trees are not covered in the inventory. So even though you might plant a lot of trees, you will not see it in the inventory. And the other option, the other example is from Germany. There were some project developers for GI projects saying, we want to reduce methane from coal mines. And then the German authorities said, well, we don't have methane from coal mines because in our inventory these emissions are zero. And when they investigated it further, it turned out that there are emissions from methane from coal mines, but they were not captured in inventory. So what they did is improve the inventory, include that new source category, and then they could also give green light to the GI projects. Another might be that the activity data is based on different sources. And normally this is easy for energy, like standard fuels that are sold on the market, and there are taxes and there are import charges, and then normally we have very good data. But there are other sectors where the data, activity data is a lot more complex to come by. Maybe the composition of waste or the use of fertilizers, especially of natural ones. And in those cases, it might be that at a measure level we have better data quality than in the inventory, and that we can use the insights from the policies in order to improve the inventory. I think Marion Vieweg is also talking about the cross fertilization of data collection of measures and inventories, and how the measures can help us improve our inventory data sources. Then another case might be that the inventory uses default emission factors, and those default emission factors cannot capture if the country is doing something to improve the emission factors. So one example are fugitive emissions for natural gas. So Colombia is considering doing their projects in order to have their gas network better closed, reduce fugitive emissions, but as long as they use default emission factors, this will not be shown in the inventory. So they need national emission factors in order to reflect that. The same is true, for example, for recycling of F-gases from aircon or from fridges. If you recycle this, of course, you need a national emission factor that reflects that instead of the default emission factor from ICE. And then there might be that different methods are used at activity level and in the inventory. We've seen also an example here in Costa Rica where in the cafe sector they're improving the carbon footprint, and one measure is to reduce the biomass use for the cafe mills. But as this is biomass, and that biomass normally is not used for other purposes, but just will then be biomass waste, enhancing the energy efficiency helps a lot to increase the economic viability of the projects, but it will not decrease the emissions in the inventory. This is also true if life cycle emissions are used at activity level. So that's very typical in transport, so to say. And there we have to compare that to the inventory, the logic of reflecting the national boundaries and also the sector boundaries. So what will be the steps to improve the inventory? So the first step is to identify the relevant categories. So look at the key source category in your inventory and see what tiers they use and whether the major policies and measures in that area will be reflected or not. Then have a look at your major policies and measures and see what inventory categories they will tackle and what tiers are used there. Based on this, the inventory should be improved. This is in line with customary improvement under IPACC and UNFCCC, so there should be an improvement plan in order to reflect those. And the third is streamline the reporting methodology for policies and measures and inventory in order not to be talking about totally different types of reductions. So this was in brief my introduction to inventoriability. As Daniel said, we're going to have publications on the issue, but we are still finalizing them. And now I'm open to questions.
Thanks a lot, Marion. Thanks a lot, Verena, for your presentation. We are inviting questions now. If there aren't any, we would continue with Marion Vieweg. But maybe we just wait some seconds to see if there are some comments or either questions. As Verena also said, there will be a publication probably by August, end of August, which will have a lot more details. I mean, it's always a trade-off between time and degree of detail which we can have in those webinars. So if you're really interested in a topic, you are invited to check on the website of the Transparency Partnership within like 6 to 8 weeks. And you might find this presentation and further details there, and you can always come back towards us, or also directly towards Verena Graichen from the Öko Institut. As I haven't received any questions so far in the chat function, I would directly introduce you with Marion Vieweg. She will have the next presentation. Marion Vieweg is an appreciated colleague who specializes in transparency, policy analysis, mitigation, and the link of all those topics with sustainable development. She has been following UNFCCC negotiations for many years and its transparency provisions and options to enhance the level of ambition. She also has led the Climate Action Tracker project, which you might know from your experiences, and also worked at the UNFCCC to support the technical analysis of biannual update reports. Marion is also a member of the expert group on MRV of the GIZ Transfer Project, where she analyzed the transport sector, and where we will also have the presentation on. Apart from that, she is member of the technical working group for transformational change and transport of the ICAT. And she will now present on how to improve the monitoring of emissions from mobile sources, and how the national GHG inventories and MRV elements can be used for these purposes. With this, I hand over to Marion and also give a warm welcome to her in this webinar. Thanks, Marion.
Thanks, Daniel, and welcome also from my side to this webinar. My presentation will go into more detail on one sector, in this case the transport sector and emissions from mobile sources, and within the TRACKS project, which is from some colleagues of Daniel's who are working with a number of countries in the transport sector to improve or to engage them into mitigation actions in the transport sector, and in that context also work on transparency questions and data availability questions with a number of countries. In the context of that project, we started to ask ourselves, coming from a different angle, very similar questions. We were working on the MRV of individual measures in the transport sector, and we're asking the question, how far can we make use of inventory data for the MRV, for the setting up of MRV systems of these measures. So a lot of, although we're coming from a slightly different starting question, I think that a lot of the issues that we find are very similar. I'll very briefly go through some terminology issues that we came across, have a very, very brief outline of the inventory approach in the transport sector, the issues around boundary questions that impact how far these two questions can be answered at the same time, and then go into how you actually do calculate MRV of mitigation actions, and how you can then use inventory data for this purpose, and that goes actually both ways. So we'll talk about synergies and limitations. In respect to terminology, we found that there was a lot of confusion because the inventory system and the IPCC uses terms of activity and emission factors slightly different than the people who are dealing with the MRV of mitigation actions in the sector. Under the IPCC, activity can mean very different things. For tier 1, it means the fuel that's used. For sometimes tier 2, but certainly tier 3, it means in the transport sector the distance that's traveled. So the type of activity data is actually changing depending on the tier. In the MRV of measures, activity normally refers to the distance traveled. So if you're talking to someone who's designing mitigation actions and mention activity data, they will think of distance traveled either expressed as vehicle kilometers or passenger kilometers and ton kilometers. So that can quickly lead to confusion. So it's important to be very clear on what you're talking about. Same we found with the use of top-down and bottom-up. Also here, the IPCC guidelines basically define this based on the level of detail of the calculations that you're doing, whereas in the MRV of measures, this is usually by type of activity data that you're using. So if you're talking about distance traveled, this is a bottom-up approach. If you're talking about fuel consumed, you're talking about a top-down approach. So this can also lead to confusion very quickly and makes communication hard. So always important to be clear what you're talking about. We then had a very close look at the inventory for the sector and what kind of data is required in different tiers. And Verena already mentioned that the tier is very important in that respect, because it requires different types of data, which is reflected here in the different parameters, but it also requires a different level of detail in disaggregation. And we see an increase in level of disaggregation, level of detail with the different tiers, but we also see this change in the type of data, so the actual parameters that you need to monitor. So, and that is very important when you're trying to match your MRV of measures and your inventory, because not all data is relevant for all kinds of measures. We also looked at the differences between 1996 and 2006 guidelines, as although non-Annex 1 countries are only required to use 1996 guidelines, a lot of countries are now starting to, or have already started to, use 2006 guidelines. So we wanted to know if this logic changes when you're using the new guidelines. And the main differences in the transport sector between the two guidelines is that there is a change in Tier 2 methodology for the CO2 and some additional parameters and a higher level of disaggregation for the Tier 3 for the bottom up. In principle, that means that there's no major change in its applicability and usability for the MRV of measures, because it's largely still the same type of data. We then looked at what kinds of issues do we encounter in trying to match MRV of individual measures and the inventory, and one clearly is the geographic scope. The inventory obviously is of a national scope, whereas particularly transport sector measures are often very local. They might be only a city, they might be a region, they might in some cases only be one bus line within a city. So it's hard to match that data requirement with the national level inventory. However, there is ways to overcome that, and we'll get to that with the limitations and synergies. But one important aspect in this is that even the national level inventory, particularly in the transport sector, is actually made from surveys and data collection that is often representative studies that are done and then extrapolated to the national level. So in the same way, you can use that data to extrapolate to your regional data that your measure is relevant for. And the other way around, you can obviously use data that you're collecting for that particular measure to help improve your inventory and extrapolate to the national level. Verena already mentioned that there is obviously an issue with the scope of the inventory. It has a clear coverage in only reflecting fuel combusted in mobile sources, whereas for the MRV of measures, depending on the type of measure, a lot of other emissions might be relevant to actually see whether it has been successful or not. In many cases, that includes fuel production, particularly where we have electric vehicles or electric forms of transport involved. Depending on the measure, it can also include vehicle production or scrapping, particularly relevant for fleet renovation programs, for example. So here we need to be very careful to see where in the overall inventory the information that we might need for the MRVF measures can be found, because not all of that is in the actual transport part of the inventory. For the MRV of individual transport measures, we have identified sort of a standard calculation mode. That's how normally you would go about figuring out your the effect of your measure. That can change slightly for freight measures. This is for passenger transport, but it's pretty standard. It's also been used for in the baseline and monitoring compendium of the UNFCCC and the transport volume there. So we're starting with the individual trips and then adding on what kinds of vehicles these trips are actually made in, how efficient these vehicles are in their fuel consumption, and then what kind of fuel is used, and that gives you the emissions. So we've used this logic to figure out for different kinds of measures what are the actual parameters that are that the measure is trying to affect, and then what kind of data and information would I need to measure whether that's been successful or not. And then from that we've looked at how far can we use inventory data at which tier level to help us in that assessment. And here it's important, and I think David will also talk about that, to distinguish between ex ante and ex post assessment. If you're looking at the projection of potential effects before you're starting or implementing your measure, you have slightly different data requirements than when you're looking at the actual determination of achieved effects ex post. So for the example of the fuel efficiency standards, our main areas of impact is the number of vehicles per vehicle type, and obviously the fuel efficiency of each vehicle. And here we find that for ex ante assessments, we actually have most of the information within a bottom-up inventory that's at least a tier 2 inventory, because here we have split up by fleet composition, and we do have disaggregated data on fuel efficiency. For ex post assessment, we find that these default values that we may be able to use on fuel efficiency from the inventory may not be sufficient, and we might actually need some actual collected data for that specific purpose. We obviously have limitations in using the inventory data for the MRVF measures, and I've already mentioned some is the geographic scope, particularly for the ex post assessment, where you really want to measure achieved effects, and that is also due to the fact that with the inventory, a lot of default values are usually used, which are not useful for the ex post assessment. We need to adjust the scope depending on the measures. That is the case for not only electricity, but also for biofuels, very important because that is reflected in the agriculture and land use sector. And normally we find that for ex-post assessments, the level of detail is not enough in the inventory, and we need to collect additional information. But having said that, there's also a lot of synergies, and as I mentioned before, if I'm actually collecting data for the MRV of my particular measure, that can feed into the national level and improve the accuracy of the national inventory. We can also use that if it's coordinated between a number of measures that are operational. We can even use that to move towards higher tiers in the national inventory if we harmonize the data collection across different measures and then use that to scale up to the national level. Data collected for higher tier inventories, as I said, are very, very useful for the ex-ante assessment of potential impacts of measures. And I think Verena already indicated earlier, to really maximize synergies, we need to make sure that data definitions and collection methods are harmonized. Where possible, frequency and timing of collection should be aligned so that data is available for use at the time when I'm trying to prepare my inventory or when I have to do my reporting on measures. And to do that, it's useful to have data formats and calculation methods consistent across different MRB systems or different measures. And to do that, institutional cooperation being formalized helps a lot. So that's been our thinking on how we can make use of information gathered in bottom-up inventories for the MRB of individual measures. But in principle, I would say most of that also goes the other way. So that's it from me, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Marion, for this very interesting presentation. Maybe you could, meanwhile, I expect some questions to be sent to us via the chat function. Explain us in how far you think that these lessons learned and these experiences you have gathered can be generalized for different countries. Or if generalization is difficult, in how far a country analysis would be necessary to come to similar conclusions like you have presented.
The exercise was done at a general level, so we didn't look at this only for a country. So we started from the theoretical level. So from our perspective, applying that to a country and actually conducting a case study would be very, very useful to find out where the devil is in the detail, as you say, and what lessons we could draw from that further hands-on experience. Problem here is a little bit in the transport sector that there is not many countries or non-Annex 1 countries that are actually using bottom-up methodologies in the transport sector because it's quite data intensive.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marion, for this response. I still haven't received any question, so maybe we can directly shift to the presentation of David Rich. Thanks again, Marion, for this very interesting presentation, and there was a lot of information, and maybe also the differentiation between ex ante, ex post, and all the three different tiers in the transport sector. It's quite a lot of information that has to be digested. As I said in the beginning, you're also open to contact to get in touch with Marion via us or directly contact her. And
Daniel,
thanks again. Yeah.
Maybe I can add, there is a paper going with this presentation, and that's available on the transfer website. So maybe you can share that with people as well.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So you would then just have to go to the GIZ website and look for the transfer project, or probably you could even find that directly through the search machines, and if not, just get in touch with us. With this, I would then. Okay, I've just received one question, Marion, which is, I just will read it to you. How do you think that methodologies can be aligned between GHG inventory guidelines and the MRV methodologies you have presented?
Well, that's a good question. I think the main issue is to align data definitions, and in principle, the calculation methods being used are very similar or are the same. What is different for the MRVF measures is obviously that you're not only looking at past developments and actual emissions, but that you're also developing assumptions on baselines and projections. So you're using the same data, but adding to that. So from my perspective, making sure that you're using the same data with the same definitions, and also using the same disaggregation, and that is very important, because there's very different ways you can disaggregate, for example, your vehicle fleet, and to make sure that when you're doing your original setup of the inventory, that you're trying to capture the realities in your country as well as possible, and as detailed as possible, to make it possible for individual measures to then reflect, use that data. For example, if motorbikes are very important in many developing countries, it might be useful to actually already differentiate different types of motorbikes in your inventory, so that you can use that depending on what kinds of measures you will have to reduce emissions from motorbikes. In other countries, like in developed countries, motorbikes are not that important, so that might not be necessary. So I think trying to find the right level of detail and the right level of disaggregation is important.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Laura, for this question, and thanks a lot, Marion, for your answer. I would now like to acquaint you with Mr. David Rich, who is a senior associate in the climate program at the World Resources Institute. The World Resources Institute, as some of you might know, coordinates a transparency working group within the NDC cluster, and also has elaborated several standards. David today will share with us his experiences with the application and the use of the policy and action standard, and some additional work he has been guiding at World Resources Institute. He was strongly involved in the elaboration of the World Resources Institute's renowned policy and action standard, that is about assessing the impacts of policies and actions. And with this short introduction, I would like to directly hand over to David. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. And hello, everyone. Today I'll touch on 4 topics here about tracking progress of NDC, policies and actions within the context of NDCs. So one is a quick overview of the policy actions themselves in the NDCs, briefly. Purposes of tracking progress of policies and actions as distinct from national inventories, and why they're both useful things to do in combination. Third, approaches to tracking progress of policies and actions. And lastly, the relationship of tracking policies and actions to greenhouse gas inventories, which we've already been hearing about in previous presentations already. So in terms of the NDCs themselves, most countries have put forward NDCs that are national greenhouse gas targets, whether they are reductions of emissions relative to base year emissions, or relative to baseline scenario emissions, or relative to emissions intensity. The vast majority of countries around the world have greenhouse gas reduction targets. However, there are a subset, around 15, that have put forward a list of actions as their NDC without a target, without an economy-wide target. And some of these are a combination of individual actions to reduce emissions with sector targets like energy efficiency targets, or renewable energy targets, or forest sector targets. So in the case of countries that have actions only, you would need to track progress of policies and actions in order to track progress toward the NDC itself in a very direct way. For all of the many other countries that have economy-wide targets, policy and action tracking is also quite important in terms of understanding how you're reaching progress toward the NDC, in terms of, are you on track or not based on what you're doing to achieve the NDC, even though the NDC itself would be tracked through the national greenhouse gas inventory. So in either situation, countries benefit from tracking progress of policies and actions, whether it's a means toward an end or it's the thing itself that you've put forward in the NDC. And this is a map from our website at kate.wri.org that maps all of the NDCs around the world, and you can sort and filter by what is the type of target, or the sectors covered, or the adaptation component, or etc. Many different ways of organizing the map. But this is looking at what I was just speaking about in terms of which countries have greenhouse gas targets versus which countries have actions in the absence of targets, or some combination. So all the countries in blue have some economy-wide target, and the countries in dark green have actions only without a target. So just to emphasize the point that most countries do have targets, in that case, tracking policies and actions is important to know how you're doing in terms of what you're implementing in order to reach the target, and in the other countries it is the target itself, or the commitment or contribution itself. Okay, and in terms of why you would track progress of policies and actions in either of those two scenarios I mentioned. You want to ensure actions are being implemented as planned. So even apart from the impacts or effects of the policy, you want to know that it's actually being carried out and implemented as planned. Track progress toward targeted outcomes in different sectors or for the country as a whole. Understand the extent to which actions taken to achieve the NDC have been effective in delivering the intended results and what additional progress is needed to achieve the NDC. Informed decision-making on which policies to implement, enhance, continue, or discontinue. Reporting on progress of actions, and meeting the Paris Agreement transparency and accounting provisions, and informing the global stocktake. So these are some reasons why tracking policies and actions is a good thing to do. Now, in terms of how to do it, if you step back, there are, I would say, 3 overarching approaches to how to do this, each of which has sort of sub-methods, but these are kind of a high-level ways of thinking about tracking progress of policies and actions from a spectrum of simpler to more complex. You could track implementation of actions. You could track indicators related to their impacts, or you could estimate the actual impacts in terms of greenhouse gas reductions and other sustainable development benefits. So it goes from simpler to more complex, and you can do one or more, or you can do all 3. The most robust approach would be to do all of these things. So I'll go through each one separately. So first, in terms of tracking implementation of actions, this is an important thing to do to ensure that actions are being implemented as planned. And you can track progress of actions along a policy implementation process or continuum from planned to adopted to implemented. And to do that, you can identify milestones for policy implementation and track progress of indicators related to each of these phases of implementation. So you could track financing of actions and whether how much money has been spent to implement and finance actions. There might be licensing, permitting, or procurement steps that can be tracked to see how far along the implementation is going. There may be information monitoring systems that are set up, compliance and enforcement procedures that are in place, or any other local policy administrative activities to make sure policies are implemented. So these are the kinds of things you can track just to make sure that the policy is actually being implemented, apart from whether it's having the desired outcomes. And for further reference, there's a link at the bottom of the screen with a WRI paper on the subject with a link, and I'm hoping either this presentation will be shared or posted online so that you can have access to these references on these slides. Now, the second type of approach is to look at outcomes of policies. A simple way to do that is to track indicators related to impacts or outcomes. And so this is about understanding whether they're having the desired impacts. And if you look at indicators for different types of policies, it can be a relatively simple approach. So, for example, if it's a renewable energy policy, you can track statistics on electricity generation by source, wind, solar, coal, natural gas, the share of renewables in the energy mix, the installed capacity by source, and you basically just track these statistics or indicators over time to see whether they're going in the right direction. And there's further examples here. If it's a public transit policy, passenger kilometers traveled by mode, like subway, bus, train, cars, taxi, etc. If it's a forestry policy, area of land restored, percent of area covered by forest stock volume, etc. So these are things to track to see whether the indicators are moving in the right direction, which is quite easy and also quite useful. The downside is they don't, by themselves, tell you whether a given policy is responsible for those changes. They could be changing for many different reasons, ongoing trends, or other policies that you're looking at, but not a particular policy you might be interested in understanding the impact of. So it's quite useful But to really understand the impact of, I'll skip over this slide. Okay, one more point on the indicators is you can, of course, look at SDG indicators alongside those that you might be tracking to understand emissions impacts. So just to mention, and some references here, of a lot of indicators you can define to track progress to the SDGs and climate impacts at the same time, which would be a recommended thing to do. I'll move on to the next slide now. To really understand whether a given policy has been effective, this comes to the Policy and Action Standard, which was mentioned, which is a way of really understanding policy impact. And to do this, well, first of all, you can do this either ex post, backward-looking, or ex ante, forward-looking. It gives you an estimate of policy impacts that demonstrates whether the policy or action is having the desired impacts. And the key here basically is you're looking relative to a baseline scenario to see whether things have improved relative to a baseline that represents what is most likely to occur in the absence of a policy that you're looking at. So there's a few basic steps on the screen. You identify all expected impacts that the policy might have, which could be a combination of positive and negative, intended and unintended. Collect the necessary data for a given policy, define the baseline scenario, define a policy scenario, which represents what you think will happen with the policy in place as opposed to without the policy in place, and subtract those two scenarios to estimate the impact. The figure just illustrates those two scenarios. In this case, you can look at the impact on renewable energy of two policies in a baseline case and a policy scenario case, and the difference is the attribution of increased renewable energy due to a renewable energy policy. That can then be converted into emission reductions by applying emission factors. And just to emphasize again that when you're doing this, you can look at various sustainable development impacts at the same time. So social, economic, environmental impacts alongside emission reductions to give you a fuller view of the impacts of policies. And to do this type of analysis, one available method is the Policy and Action Standard, which is explains how to do this, and the link is on the screen. The website at this link has the standard, and as well it has e-learning courses, and both of those in Spanish, French, and English. There's a calculation tool you can use on the website, and additional sector-level guidance to complement the general standard. And one other method, upcoming resource for additional methods, is the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, or ICAT, which is currently developing new guidance consistent with the Policy and Action Standards, so sector-level greenhouse gas guidance for agriculture, forestry, buildings, renewable energy, and transport. More detailed guidance on how to do sustainable development impacts at the same time as greenhouse gas impacts, transformational change guidance, and stakeholder participation and technical review. So these will be several new resources available this summer in draft form, which also are compatible with the Policy and Action Standard for how to do this policy impact assessment. And the last thing I wanted to mention as I wrap up, I know we're at the end of the session. Basically, greenhouse gas inventory accounting and policy and action level accounting are two distinct things. They're compatible and basically serve slightly different functions and should both be done to serve different purposes. We heard in previous presentations there are overlaps in data and methods, but they're not the same thing. So just to emphasize that they can be done in the most compatible and harmonized way possible, but they have different pros and cons basically. And the inventory is comprehensive, but doesn't explain why emissions are changing. The policy level accounting does explain why things are changing, but is not a comprehensive account of national emissions. To track progress toward an NDC at the national level, you should use the the inventory over time and track progress. And this is a simple illustration of how to do that in relation to base year emissions and in relation to target year emissions, which is the level of emissions you're aiming for in the target year. There's a further reference here to the mitigation goal standard for how to do this type of accounting. And I will skip to the end and just say that basically the recommended approach would be to combine these two approaches into an integrated target setting, policy design, and tracking cycle, where you apply both approaches at multiple points in time, from designing the target or NDC using the inventory, but also thinking about policy level impacts. You design policies and actions that can help you meet that target, which involves policy impacts. You then implement those actions, track progress at both the inventory level and the action level. And I'm going quickly here, but if you combine all these into a cycle and implement this over time, I think it's the most robust way to track progress and account over time. So that's it. Thank you very much. I know we're out of time, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David, for this presentation, and it's, I mean, a really exciting topic. You mentioned especially these linkages between accounting at the policy in action level or the level of the national GIZ inventories. And we actually have received a question from Mr. Harald Winkler, which goes in this direction. And he asks if you, David, agree that under the Paris Agreement, only those countries for whom actions are at the core of their NDCs, those can be held accountable for the implementation of those actions.
In a sense, yes. Yes, I think so. In a kind of narrow way, I would say, because I think ultimately everyone would be held accountable to the implementation of actions which lead to the emissions outcomes, which everyone has agreed to. So for all countries, actions are necessary to reach the targets or the contribution, whether it's a target or an action. But in a strict sense, I think that the method for holding countries accountable, in the case of countries with targets, the inventory, I would think, is the main way, the primary source of information for understanding have you met the target or not. Whereas countries with actions at the core of the NDC, the inventory is not relevant to the commitment, and instead the actions are what's relevant.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. We also have another question from Mr. Raul Salas. He asks what you would suggest for those countries that have peaking NDC targets and then that want to use the policy and action standard. And also a second part of his question is in how far the standard can be used to avoid double counting.
Okay, yes, double counting, very good question. I mean, policies and actions overlap with each other. And so if you assessed each one separately and added them all up, you would likely be, overcounting, possibly undercounting, but there'd be some overlap in the emissions impacts. So it is quite important to, especially within any given sector, in the energy sector, for example, to really think about the relationship between policies and not just add them up which would lead to overcounting of impacts. There is guidance in the policy and action standard about how to do that, how to think about those relationships and overlaps and avoid those double counting issues. Assuming that was the question. Peaking targets. So I would recommend the mitigation goal standard as a method for tracking progress toward peaking NDC targets, how to do the accounting for that. Because you would then be looking at the national inventory and looking at when does the national emissions peak and decline over time based on the inventory. In that case, the policy and action standard again helps you understand how to reduce how to understand the impacts of policies taken to reduce emissions, but at the big picture level, you would use the the national inventory in combination with the mitigation goal standard, which explains how to do accounting for NDCs.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot, Verena, Marion, David, for your very interesting presentations. I hope that all participants enjoyed and learned something new about the linkages between the policy and action level and the NDC accounting level. You're free to consult the Transparency Partnership website, where you will find information on the partnership itself, on the foreseen country or regional meetings, where the Accounting Roots project is happy to provide some inputs on the results of the project as well, or just to look for the publications that will be made available or have already been made available. If you have any concrete questions, you can also use the general email account webinar.ndc.accounting@giz.de, which we just opened for the purpose of this webinar series. Sorry for the delay. Thanks again for all participants to be here, and all presenters for their very useful inputs. Thanks a lot. Nice day or nice evening. Bye.